In an upscale North Carolina kitchen, Mrs. Hill had just drained her retirement savings to save her son's home, only to face a brutal betrayal from her daughter-in-law, Gertrude, who cast her out to make room for her own parents. Little did Gertrude know, the sprawling home right across the street had just been bought by the very woman she had thrown away. Hi everyone, I'm Casey. Today's story is about more than just a house. It is about an American mother reclaiming her dignity in the sunset of her life. Let's listen to the story of Mrs. Hill, a woman who showed us that when a mother is pushed to her limits, her wisdom and grace become an unstoppable force. I still remember the aroma of the roast beef in the oven, a savory scent I had spent all afternoon preparing to welcome Gertrude's parents. I had imagined a warm dinner, a simple moment of connection between families. But the air in that North Carolina dining room felt unnaturally chilled, like a sudden frost hitting in the middle of a humid summer evening. The silence was broken by the sharp clatter of Gertrude's fork hitting her porcelain plate. She looked at me with eyes that held no affection, only the cold precision of someone finishing a business deal. "Mrs. Hill," she began, her voice devoid of any emotion. "My parents will be staying here long term. You know your ground floor bedroom is the only convenient space for them. You either need to move out of that room or find another place to live entirely." My breath hitched, and a weight settled heavily in my chest. I looked toward Dwayne, my own son. I thought of the years I spent as a financial professional, and how I had used every cent of my hard-earned retirement savings to save this very house from foreclosure during the market crash. I did it for him. But Dwayne just kept his head down, focused on cutting the meat on his plate as if his life depended on it. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't say a word. His silence was 1,000 times more painful than Gertrude's demands. It was the sound of a bond snapping in two. A bitter ache rose in my throat, and a wave of numbness washed over me. I didn't cry. I wouldn't let them see me break. I stood up slowly, feeling a strange, quiet resolve. "I understand," I said, my voice soft but steady. I went to my room, looking at the familiar photos and the curtains I had picked out with such care. Within 10 minutes, I was walking toward the door with nothing but a single suitcase. I could hear the muffled voices of Clarence and Dorothy through the door as I stepped onto the porch. They were already talking about what color they wanted to paint my room. I took a deep breath of the night air, feeling the Charlotte humidity on my skin. I wasn't going far. I looked at the house directly across the street, the one with the for sale sign I had been watching for quite some time. "This journey is only beginning, Gertrude, and I think you'll find I am much stronger than you ever imagined." The oak door behind me closed with a hollow thud, a sound so final it felt like the snapping of the last thread connecting me to the place I had called home for decades. I stood there on the sidewalk, under the amber glow of a Charlotte street lamp, my fingers white from gripping the handle of my single suitcase. I did not leave immediately. A small, perhaps foolish part of me still hoped that Dwayne would come running out, take my hand, and tell me he was sorry, that he had made a mistake and I should stay. But the porch remained empty. Instead, the quiet of the neighborhood was broken by the hum of a polished SUV pulling into the driveway. It was Clarence and Dorothy Webster. They stepped out of the vehicle, surrounded by oversized luggage and the kind of boisterous laughter people usually save for luxury vacations. I pulled back into the shadows of the old oak trees, watching Gertrude rush out to greet them with an eagerness she had not shown me in years. She threw her arms around her mother and then gestured toward the house, the very house I had spent sleepless nights worrying over, the one I had drained my retirement fund to protect from the banks. "Come in," Gertrude said, her voice carrying clearly through the night air, sharp and cold. "Your room on the first floor is all ready for you. It belongs to you now." They crossed the threshold without a single glance back to see where the woman who had just occupied that room had gone. About an hour later, as I sat silently in my old sedan parked across the street, I saw Gertrude struggle out to the curb with a heavy cardboard box. Under the glare of the porch light, I recognized the shapes inside. They were my most precious small things. There was the chipped ceramic bowl I had bought on an anniversary trip to Asheville with my late husband, and the old wooden frames that held a lifetime of faces. I heard Dorothy Webster call out from the open window, asking why I had kept such outdated junk in the room, saying it made the whole house look poor. Gertrude let out a short, dismissive laugh and replied that old people just cling to things that have no real value. She promised her mother she would order new silk curtains and crystal vases the very next day. Seeing that bowl, the last physical piece of my husband, sitting precariously on top of a trash heap, made something inside me turn to stone. The urge to cry simply vanished, replaced by a clarity so cold it felt like ice in my veins. They looked at me and saw someone who was disposable because I had nothing but a suitcase. They saw a woman who was just taking up space, someone who no longer had a voice. They had completely forgotten who I was before I became their safety net. I turned the key in the ignition and felt the engine hum to life. As I slowly pulled away toward the real estate office, where I had made a late appointment, I looked back at the living room window one last time. Gertrude wanted modern things, and she wanted power. I decided right then that I would show her exactly what real power looked like, and I would do it from a view she never expected. The first night in that cramped motel room just a few blocks from my old neighborhood felt like an eternity. I kept my phone on the nightstand, the screen a dark, cold mirror reflecting the flickering neon of the vacancy sign outside. I found myself making excuses for the silence. I told myself the signal was weak in this part of town, or perhaps Dwayne was simply waiting for Gertrude to fall asleep before he dared to reach out to me. Every time a notification buzzed, usually just a spam email or a weather alert, my heart would leap with a painful jolt, only to wither when I saw it wasn't him. Dwayne's silence in that house, at that very moment, was far more terrifying than any of Gertrude's sharpest insults. It was the sound of a son letting go of his mother. The next morning, driven by a ghost of a habit, I found myself driving past my old home. No, it wasn't my home anymore. It was now the Webster residence. Through the large living room window that I used to polish every Saturday morning until it sparkled, I saw Clarence. He was lounging in my late husband's favorite leather wingback chair, casually reading the paper, with his feet propped up on the mahogany coffee table. Gertrude walked into view, smiling and carrying a tray of steaming muffins, the very same muffins she used to complain were too carb-heavy whenever I baked them. They looked perfectly happy, a picture of domestic bliss, constructed on the ruins of the dignity I had left behind. There was no sign that they even remembered the woman they had cast out into the night. I watched Dwayne step out onto the porch. He stood there, looking toward the road, but his gaze was vacant and hollow. He wasn't searching for me. He was just checking to see if the trash had been collected, a soulless habit performed by a man who had lost his spine. At that moment, the last flicker of hope inside me died out, like a candle finally reaching the end of its wick and drowning in its own wax. I didn't feel the familiar sting of bitterness anymore. Instead, a strange, chilling sense of relief washed over me. When you finally realize you have absolutely nothing left to lose, you become dangerously strong. I reached for the thick folder of financial documents I always kept in my bag. Numbers had always been my true language. Numbers do not lie, and they never betray you if you know how to command them. I drove straight to the local real estate office. When I walked in, the broker probably saw just another frail, tired old woman looking for a place to wither away. But the moment I started discussing cash flows, asset liquidation, and a full cash offer for the property directly across the street from my son, her entire demeanor shifted. I signed the purchase agreement with the steadiest hand I have ever possessed. Gertrude wanted me to vanish from their lives. Fine. But now, every single morning when she pulls back those expensive new curtains, the very first thing she will see is my unshakable presence staring right back at her. Few things hurt more than the cold silence of a loved one. Seeing Mrs. Hill face Dwee's betrayal alone moved Casey deeply. Was Dwee silent out of fear, or did he see his mother as a burden? Have you ever had to find strength alone like Mrs. Hill? Please, share your heart in the comments. The sound of my new key turning in the lock was a crisp, metallic snap that echoed through the quiet hallway, a sound that signaled the beginning of a life where only those who are worthy are invited inside. As I stepped into the sprawling foyer of the house directly across the street from my old life, I expected to feel a hollow sense of loss. But instead, I was met with a breathtaking vastness. The air here was different. It didn't carry the heavy, suffocating scent of constant scrutiny or the bitter tang of Gertrude's insults. There were no more lowered heads or the quiet, spineless retreats of my son. In this house, there was only me, the weight of my secret financial legacy, and a crystal-clear plan to teach those ungrateful souls the true value of a mother. This new home in Charlotte was a masterpiece of light, with soaring ceilings and pale oak floors that seemed to soak up every drop of the golden North Carolina sunshine. I went from room to room, throwing open every single window to let the breeze sweep away the last lingering shadows of my despair. I had already secured the finest renovation team in the county, and this morning, they arrived with a kind of punctuality that reminded me of my own professional days. A middle-aged man with a kind, weathered smile and the calloused hands of someone who truly understood the value of hard work approached me. He introduced himself as Marcus. He told me they were going to transform the front room into the most impressive home office I had ever seen. He paused for a moment, looking at the blueprints, and asked if I was absolutely certain about the panoramic, floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass window I had requested for the front wall. I looked across the street at my former home, which sat silent and brooding in the shade of the old oaks, and I nodded with a firmness that surprised even myself. I told him I was certain because I wanted to see everything, and I didn't want to miss a single detail. Marcus didn't pry or ask unnecessary questions. He simply offered a respectful smile and began coordinating his crew. That silent, professional respect from a complete stranger warmed me in a way my own son had forgotten how to do years ago. By noon, the rhythmic sound of drills and hammers filled the house, a productive symphony that felt like progress. During a short break, I heard a gentle, rhythmic knocking at the front door. I opened it to find a woman roughly my own age, holding a tray with a steaming, lattice-topped apple pie that filled the air with the scent of caramelized fruit and warm cinnamon. She introduced herself as Martha from next door. She had seen someone moving in and wanted to offer a proper neighborhood welcome. We ended up sitting together on the front steps, which were still a bit dusty from the ongoing construction, and shared a few slices of that sweet, warm pie. Martha spoke of the local farmers markets on the weekends and a group of local grandmothers who took great pride in their community gardens. She looked at me with a gaze that was genuinely observant and kind. noting that it looked like I had been on a long and difficult journey. She told me that if I ever needed anything, whether it was a cup of sugar or just someone to listen, she was only a few steps away. I smiled, feeling the sweetness of the pie on my tongue and a strange tightening in my throat. It was almost absurd that a woman I had known for 20 minutes could offer more genuine concern than the daughter-in-law I had spent a fortune to keep from bankruptcy. These strangers were beginning to convince me that the world was still full of light, provided I had the courage to step out of the darkness of my own endurance. As evening began to settle over Charlotte, the massive panoramic glass was finally in place. It acted like a giant camera lens, framing the house where Dway and Gertrude lived and bringing every movement into sharp focus. I moved my heavy mahogany desk right up against the glass, placing my laptop and my thick stacks of bank statements exactly where I could see the world outside. From this vantage point, the view was perfect. I could see Gertrude pacing in the kitchen, her body language tense and irritable, as she appeared to be snapping at Dway. I saw Clarence and Dorothy Webster lounging on the back patio with beers in their hands, enjoying the very yard I had paid to have landscaped and maintained for years. They had no idea that from this moment on, every entitled gesture and every lazy afternoon was being recorded by my silent observation. I sat back and took a long, slow sip of Earl Grey tea, feeling a surge of cold, revitalizing energy through my veins. I was no longer the discarded Mrs. Hill who had been forced out into the night. I was the owner of the house across the street, the woman who held their financial oxygen in her hands, and the one who would stand right here to witness the inevitable collapse of a palace built on ingratitude. Tonight, for the first time in years, I would sleep a deep and peaceful sleep, wrapped in the freedom I had finally reclaimed for myself. The moonlight in North Carolina is exceptionally bright tonight, spilling through my massive panoramic window and resting on my hands like a cold silver shroud. I sit in the absolute stillness of my new sanctuary, the only other light coming from the clinical blue glow of my laptop screen. Just a few days ago, I was the quiet, invisible mother cooking in that kitchen across the street, making sure everyone else was fed and comfortable. Tonight, I am a woman transformed. These numbers on my screen are no longer just data. They are my instruments of justice. As a former financial consultant, I spent decades mastering the flow of capital, and I know exactly how to make these figures sting when they are withdrawn. I log into my secure banking portal and navigate to the automated payments. There it is, sitting like a silent promise. Recurring transfer, $1,200. For years, this money has flowed without fail from my account into theirs. A quiet supplement that allowed Gertrude and Dway to maintain a lifestyle their own salaries could never touch. It paid for the high-speed internet, the premium landscaping, the insurance on their cars, and those frequent, overpriced dinners Gertrude loves to brag about on social media. I hover the cursor over the cancel button. For a brief second, Dwee's face flashes in my mind, the way he looked as a little boy when he was scared of the dark. But then, the memory is replaced by the sight of my husband's chipped ceramic bowl sitting in a trash heap on the curb. I remember my son's cowardly, downcast eyes while his wife threw me out of my own home. My finger clicks down, hard and final. The transfer is deleted. The financial oxygen has been cut. I wonder how many days it will take for Gertrude to realize that her morning lattes and that polished SUV don't just appear by magic. I stand up and walk over to my old suitcase, reaching into a hidden side pocket for a small wooden box I have kept safe for a long time. Inside, there are no diamonds or heirlooms. Instead, there is a single yellowing piece of paper that smells faintly of old cedar. It is the promissory note I had both Dewey and Gertrude sign years ago, the day I emptied my savings, $180,000, to save their home from being taken by the bank. Back then, I insisted on the signature out of professional habit, a risk management measure I never truly thought I would have to enforce against my own flesh and blood. Gertrude had laughed at me that day, calling me paranoid and saying that family doesn't need contracts. That paper has been my secret letter under the pillow, waiting for a day that I prayed would never come. But it is here now. That money was never a gift. It was a legally binding loan with clear terms of repayment upon demand. I take a high-resolution photo of the document and email it directly to my longtime attorney with a short, clinical message. I tell her to initiate formal debt collection proceedings immediately and specify that there will be no settlements and no compromises. As I close my laptop, I look across the street. Gertrude's bedroom light is still burning bright. She is likely dreaming of how she will spend her next weekend, or how she will redecorate the room she took from me. She has no idea that the walls of her house of cards are already starting to tremble. Tomorrow, the payments will bounce, the credit cards will be declined, and the heavy shadow of a $180,000 debt will descend upon her world. I lean back in my chair and take a slow sip of cool water. Reclaiming my wealth feels exactly like reclaiming my soul. It is sharp, it is clear, and it is absolutely necessary. Monday morning in Charlotte usually begins with the frantic hum of commuters and the rich, roasted scent of coffee drifting through the neighborhood. I sat in my new office, my fingers lightly circling a bone china teacup as I kept my eyes fixed on that massive panoramic window. Across the street, the house I had poured my heart and my savings into protecting still sat in a state of artificial peace. I knew that within minutes, as the first rays of sunlight hit those front steps, the reality I had set in motion the night before would begin to tighten its grip around them. The numbers I had deleted from my banking app were no longer just digits on a screen. They had become black holes in the middle of Gertrude's hollow, expensive life. I watched the world wake up, feeling a strange, cold clarity that I hadn't felt in years. Around 8 o'clock, the front door of Dewey's house swung open. Gertrude stepped out onto the porch, draped in an ivory silk robe that probably cost more than a month's worth of my groceries. She held a tall Starbucks cup in one hand, looking every bit like a queen who had just finished a successful conquest. She took a long, deep breath of the morning air, surveying the neighborhood with a look of smug satisfaction. Then, almost as if drawn by a magnetic force, her eyes drifted toward my new home, the property that had sat vacant for so long. Through my glass wall, I looked directly into her eyes. I didn't hide, and I didn't look away. I simply sat there in my high-back mahogany chair and slowly raised my teacup in a silent, perfectly calm greeting. I saw the exact moment her world fractured. The Starbucks cup tilted in her hand, and a stream of dark brown liquid splashed across her pristine white silk. She stood frozen, her eyes widening in a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She actually rubbed her eyes, as if she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, trying to process the fact that the mother-in-law she had discarded like trash was now sitting in the most luxurious office in the neighborhood, right in front of her. She stumbled back, tripping over the welcome mat, and practically scrambled back inside the house, leaving a messy brown trail on the hardwood floor. the panic was only beginning. About an hour later, through the kitchen window, I could see Gertrude pacing frantically, her phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. She was shouting at Dwayne, her gestures wild and jagged. I could almost feel the vibration of her voice from across the street. I knew exactly what was happening. She had likely tried to book her weekly hair appointment or buy yet another designer handbag online, only to find that her primary source of funding had simply vanished. There is a specific kind of terror that hits a person when they realize the financial oxygen they have been breathing for free has been cut off. Dwayne stood there in the middle of the kitchen, looking exhausted and small in his wrinkled pajamas. He seemed to be trying to explain something, but Gertrude wasn't listening. She threw her phone onto the granite countertop with a crash that I could practically hear through the glass. I knew the mail had been delivered moments before, and the pile of bills from Duke Energy and the insurance companies was sitting in their box like a ticking time bomb. Without my $1,200 monthly contribution, their flashy lifestyle was like a luxury car that had suddenly run out of gas in the middle of a steep hill. What struck me most, however, was the sheer, breathtaking entitlement of the Websters. While Gertrude was unraveling inside, Clarence and Dorothy stepped out onto the back patio. They moved with a casual laziness, settling themselves onto the expensive sun loungers that I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. They seemed completely indifferent to the storm brewing inside the house. Dorothy was tapping away at her iPad, likely browsing for new silk curtains to replace the ones I had chosen for my old room, the room they had so eagerly snatched away. They were lounging there, consuming the electricity and water I could no longer pay for, eating the gourmet food from a refrigerator that Dwayne had no way of refilling. I watched Dwayne walk out to the patio, his face twisted in a look of desperate pleading. He was clearly asking Clarence for some kind of temporary help. But Clarence just dismissed him with a wave of his hand and a cold, thin laugh before going back to his newspaper. The selfishness of the Websters was a perfect mirror of Gertrude herself. They were there to take, never to give. Watching my son be treated with such contempt by the very people he had chosen over me made my chest tighten with a familiar ache. But my mind stayed sharp. He needed to see this. He needed to feel the weight of the people he had invited into our lives. Just before noon, a courier van pulled up to the curb. A man in a crisp uniform stepped out, carrying a large, heavy yellow envelope. I felt a small, grim smile touch my lips. That was the letter from my attorney. The formal demand for the immediate repayment of the $180,000 loan, backed by every piece of legal evidence we possessed. Gertrude was the one who came out to meet the courier. I watched through my panoramic window as she tore the envelope open right there on the sidewalk. I saw her face go from a flush of anger to a ghostly, sickly white, and then to a bruised shade of purple. Her knees actually gave out, and she sank down onto the front steps, the legal documents trembling in her hands. This was no longer a petty argument about a bedroom or a mother-in-law moving out. This was a full-scale legal and financial catastrophe that could strip them of everything they owned. She looked up and stared at my house, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and absolute paralyzing fear. I stood up slowly and pulled the silk cords to close my heavy curtains, leaving them with nothing but a wall of silence. I sat back down in my swivel chair, feeling a wave of exhaustion settle over me. Witnessing your own child's suffering is never easy for a mother, no matter how much they have hurt you. But I knew that if I didn't follow through with this, Dwayne would spend the rest of his life hiding in the shadows of people who only saw him as a tool to be used. I looked at the framed photograph of my late husband on the corner of my desk. I whispered to him that I was protecting what we had built together, the legacy that Gertrude thought she could just consume and throw away. She wanted me to feel the pain of being abandoned, but instead, I was giving her a masterclass in the very independence she always claimed to have, but never actually earned. Tonight, the house across the street wouldn't be filled with the sound of the Websters' smug laughter. There would only be the heavy, suffocating silence of people realizing that there is no such thing as a free meal, especially when that meal was paid for with the blood and tears of the woman they thought they could break. I took a slow breath, feeling the quiet strength of my new home surround me, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like the architect of my own destiny. The Charlotte night air this time of year has a way of creeping through the oak leaves, bringing a crisp chill that settles deep into the bones of the neighborhood. I sat in my new living room without turning on a single lamp, letting only the rhythmic flickering of the fireplace cast long, dancing shadows against my fresh, cream-colored walls. Directly across the street, my old home was ablaze with every light turned on, a glowing box of modern entitlement. I knew exactly where they had been tonight. Gertrude had made a point of announcing her reservation at the Fig Tree, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, to celebrate her parents officially taking over my old suite. They had driven away in that luxury SUV, the same one I had been making the monthly payments on for 3 long years. I sat there in the darkness, sipping a glass of water, knowing that the celebration they expected was about to turn into a very public lesson in reality. Around 10 o'clock, the sharp sweep of headlights cut across my window as the SUV pulled into their driveway. The engine died instantly, but instead of the usual boisterous laughter and slamming doors that followed their nights out, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. I stood back, partially hidden by the weight of my new silk curtains, and watched as Gertrude stepped out of the vehicle. Her movements were jagged and frantic, her heels clicking against the asphalt with a sharp, angry rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the cold night air. Even from across the street, I could see the crimson flush on her face and the raw humiliation burning in her eyes. I didn't need to be there to see what had happened. I could perfectly imagine the scene in that elegant dining room, surrounded by Charlotte high society and her own parents, when the server returned her platinum card with a polite, devastating headshake. I could almost hear the quiet words informing her that the transaction had been declined due to an insufficient credit limit. That public blow to her vanity was likely more painful than any lecture I could have ever given her. She had spent every cent in that joint account, never once imagining that the person who kept the machine running had finally walked away. "Dewey, what on earth did you do with the accounts?" Gertrude screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet stillness of the street. She didn't care who heard her as she threw her expensive designer handbag onto the frost-covered lawn. Dewey climbed out of the driver's side, his shoulders slumped and his chin tucked into his chest in that pathetic way he always did when he felt cornered. He kept his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking small and broken under the glow of the street lamp. I caught the low murmur of his voice as the wind carried his words toward me. He told her that I had canceled the recurring transfers and that he had tried to warn her they were in trouble. Gertrude didn't stop. She began a frantic, high-pitched rant about how embarrassed she was in front of her friends and her parents. It was almost tragic in its absurdity. Her biggest concern wasn't the fact that her mother-in-law was gone or how they were going to pay their actual debts. Her world was ending because her carefully curated image had shattered at a dinner table. Clarence and Dorothy Webster climbed out of the back of the car, but they didn't stop to comfort their daughter or offer a single word of support. They moved like ghosts, slipping past the shouting couple and disappearing into the house as quickly as possible. They were the perfect examples of fair-weather guests, people who were happy to be family when the wine was flowing and the bills were paid, but who became complete strangers the moment the money dried up. A few minutes later, I saw Dorothy's silhouette through the window of my old bedroom. She was turning on every light, likely running the hot water and cranking up the heat to the highest setting, completely indifferent to the fact that her son-in-law was drowning in a financial crisis. Gertrude had fought so hard to bring them into that house and push me out, and now their very presence was becoming a suffocating weight that was crushing the life out of her marriage. The irony was so thick, it was almost palpable. I turned back to my armchair and took a sip of my tea, which had long since gone cold. A part of me, the part of a mother that is hardwired to protect her child from any kind of pain, was screaming at me to pick up the phone. It would have been so easy to transfer enough money to Dewey's account to settle the restaurant bill and give them another month of breathing room. But then I looked at my own hands, the hands that had worked 40 years to build a legacy, only to be treated like an inconvenience by the very person I had nurtured. If I helped Dewey now, I wouldn't be saving him. I would be ensuring that he never grew a spine, that he never saw the true nature of the people he had chosen to surround himself with. He needed to feel this cold. He needed to see what happened when the safety net was gone. I set the teacup down on the side table, my gaze turning cold and unwavering. Tonight, there would be no phone call and no secret wire transfer. I was going to let them struggle in the wreckage of their own ingratitude. I would remain here, in my quiet sanctuary, directly across the street, acting as a silent observer to the painful, necessary process of my son's awakening. He had to learn that in this world, love and respect are not just words you say when you want something. They are the foundation of everything. I leaned back and watched the lights across the street flicker one by one as the reality of their new life began to settle in. Watching a child fail is heartbreaking. Mrs. Hill chose tough love over enabling Dewey, despite the pain he caused. Could you stay silent? Or would your heart soften? Is tough love the only way to save a lost soul? As a mother or grandmother, please share your wisdom in the comments. The clock on my wall had just ticked toward 1 a.m. A fine North Carolina mist had begun to blur the streetlights outside, turning the neighborhood into a smudge of gray and amber. I was just about to close my ledger when I saw a shadow slinking across the asphalt. The figure moved with a heavy, hesitant gait, looking over its shoulder like a criminal afraid of being caught in the act. The knocking at my door was soft and rhythmic, a frantic vibration that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who was standing there. The faint, familiar scent of cheap cologne, mixed with stale tobacco smoke, was already seeping through the cracks of the doorframe. I opened it, and there stood my only son, Dewey. His hair was a disheveled mess, and his eyes were bloodshot from a mixture of exhaustion and the kind of pressure that breaks a man who was never taught how to stand on his own. "Mom, please, can I come in?" he asked, his voice sounding thin and ragged, like a plea for help echoing from the bottom of a well. I stepped back and gestured for him to enter, not saying a word. Dewey practically collapsed into the velvet armchair in my living room, his hands trembling as he laced his fingers together until his knuckles turned white. He looked around my new home, and I could tell the elegance and the quiet order of the space made him feel suffocated. It was a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind across the street. Mom, Gertrude is losing her mind, he began, his voice cracking. She is threatening to file for divorce if I don't make that $180,000 lawsuit go away. And her parents, Clarence and Dorothy, they won't stop complaining. They keep asking why the heater isn't high enough and why the refrigerator is empty. They look at me like I am the failure. I walked into the kitchen and poured him a mug of black coffee, the steam rising in the quiet air. I didn't offer him any sugar, and I didn't offer him any empty comfort. Dway, are you here because you need a check? Or are you here because you are truly sorry? I asked. My voice was so calm, it surprised even me. He looked up at me with that same pleading expression he had used his entire life to manipulate my heart. You know I don't have that kind of money, Mom. $180,000? Are you really going to take your own son to court? We are family. This is supposed to be about love, not contracts and lawyers. I didn't answer him immediately. Instead, I walked over to my mahogany desk and picked up a thick folder that my attorney had prepared. I sat down across from him and laid the documents out on the coffee table. Family, Dway? Let us look at what family actually looks like in black and white, I said, pointing to the spreadsheets I had highlighted in red. Over the last 5 years, I have paid $72,000 just to cover your family's basic living expenses. I gave you $180,000 in cash to save your home from foreclosure when you hid the truth from me about your failed investments. And what was my return on that investment? I flipped to the next page, showing him a high-resolution photo I had taken of my husband's chipped ceramic bowl sitting in the trash on the curb. Do you remember this bowl, Dway? It was a wedding gift from your father. Gertrude threw it away the second I walked out the door. And you, my son, you stood there and watched her throw me out so you could make room for people who have never contributed a single dime to that roof over your head. Is that your definition of family? Dway bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his own cowardice. He began to cry, the late and hollow tears of a man who is only sorry because he is finally feeling the consequences of his actions. But I wasn't finished. I reached for my phone and pulled up an audio file from the old security system I had installed in the house months ago to monitor for leaks while I was traveling. The recording was grainy, but Gertrude's voice was unmistakable. The speakers filled the room with her cold, calculating tone. Dway, just ignore the old woman, she had said. She has money tucked away in a secret fund somewhere. Just keep pushing her to give up the room. If she fights us, we tell her she won't see the grandkids anymore. She will cough up the cash eventually. Dway looked up, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked as though he had been struck. He had spent years defending her, telling himself she was just a strong woman doing what was best for their family. But he couldn't unhear the malice in her voice. Mom, I didn't know, he stammered. She told me you wanted to move out to have your own space. She said you were tired of us. I looked directly into his eyes, performing the most painful task a mother can ever do, which is cutting the cord of dependency once and for all. You didn't know because you chose not to know, Dway. You chose silence because it was easier than standing up to your wife. You let your mother be humiliated because you thought my kindness was a well that would never run dry. I gathered the papers back into the folder. I am not withdrawing the lawsuit. It isn't because I need the money. I have more than enough. It is because I need you to finally be responsible for the life you chose. If you want to save your marriage, go earn the money yourself. If you want my forgiveness, go learn how to be a man with a backbone first." Dwayne stood up, and in the dim light of the living room, he looked 10 years older than he had when he walked in. He looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see the gaze of a beggar. I saw the stunned realization of someone who had finally seen the truth. He didn't ask for money again. He turned and walked toward the door, his movements slow and deliberate. "I understand, Mom," he whispered. As he disappeared back into the rainy night, I closed the door and leaned my back against it, feeling a sharp ache in my chest. I had just pushed my only child into the middle of a storm, but I knew that the only way he would ever learn to walk was if I stopped carrying him. I went back to my desk and took a long sip of my tea. Across the street, the lights in the Webster house had finally gone dark, but I knew a different kind of war was about to begin inside those walls. Gertrude would soon find out that her source of effortless wealth was gone, and the Websters would realize that their free paradise was crumbling into dust. I watched the rain streaks on my window, looking like tears against the glass. I had done what was necessary. Healing isn't always about hugs and soft words. Sometimes it is a radical surgery to cut away the rot of ingratitude and lies. Tonight, I prayed that Dwayne would find the strength to choose the right path, even if it was paved with thorns. I took a deep breath and felt a strange, quiet peace settle over me. I had reclaimed the truth, and that was the first real step toward reclaiming my life. After Dwayne left and disappeared into the rainy night, the restlessness that had plagued my soul for years simply vanished. I climbed into my new bed, the sheets made of fine linen that smelled faintly of the sun and lavender. It was a simple, clean scent that I had forgotten during all those years of being consumed by everyone else's needs and demands. That night, I slept a deep and dreamless sleep, the kind of rest that only comes when a heavy burden has finally been lifted from your chest. When the first light of the Charlotte dawn began to filter through my curtains, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in decades. The crushing weight of overprotecting a grown man was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. From my office window, I watched as reality finally arrived for the household across the street. Early that morning, a white truck with a Duke Energy logo pulled up to the curb. I saw Gertrude scramble out of the front door, her hair unbrushed and her face etched with a frantic, desperate energy. She was pointing at her phone, her mouth moving in a series of sharp, jagged explanations. But the technician just shook his head and continued with his work. Rules are rules, and in the world of finance, there is no room for sentimentality when the bills go unpaid. A few moments later, the porch lights across the street flickered and died. It was a small but powerful symbol of the collapse of a life built on consumption without contribution. I saw Dorothy Webster standing by the living room window, likely complaining about the coffee maker and the rising humidity inside the house now that the air conditioning was gone. Their entitlement had finally collided with the cold, hard facts of their own insolvency. Without my money to cushion the blow, they were realizing they were no longer the elite members of the neighborhood they pretended to be. I turned my attention back to the small, meaningful things in my own home. I reached into my jewelry box and pulled out my late husband's old silver pocket watch. The ticking was steady and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the honest man he had always been. I thought back to the early years, when we saved every spare nickel to buy our first tiny house, and I remembered the lesson he used to try and teach our son. He would tell Dway that the true value of a man is found in how he protects his family with honor and hard work, not through shortcuts and deceit. I felt a sense of quiet closure, knowing that I was finally delivering the last and most important lesson my husband would have wanted Dway to learn. My own recovery didn't come from watching them suffer, but from the realization that I still possessed enough self-respect to stop allowing my own child to trample on the legacy we had built with our lives. I began to arrange a bouquet of fresh hydrangeas in a crystal vase, placing them on my desk where they could catch the morning light. I found that I was no longer observing the house across the street with bitterness or anger. I was looking at them from the perspective of an outsider, someone who was no longer responsible for the mess they had created. Gertrude was still on the porch, likely trying to call someone for a loan. But in the professional world, once your credibility is gone, it is almost impossible to reclaim. I took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air in my sanctuary and felt a surge of new life. I realized that my future would no longer be defined by how much I sacrificed, but by how much I loved myself. The wreckage across the street would have to be the foundation for Dway's growth, while this house would be the launchpad for my own freedom. I had finally learned to say no to injustice, and in doing so, I had said yes to the woman I was always meant to become. Saturday morning in Charlotte is usually a time for quiet yard work or slow walks through the neighborhood, but the peace of our street was broken by an event no one could have predicted. From my new office window, I watched as a jagged, hand-written cardboard sign was hammered into the grass in front of Dway's home. Garage sale, it read. Gertrude, a woman who valued her social standing more than her own soul, and who always craved to be the center of everyone's admiration, was now standing on the curb, hawking her last symbols of luxury to anyone passing by. I saw her laying out designer handbags, expensive clothes, and even the premium set of golf clubs I had bought for my son years ago. She wore oversized sunglasses, keeping her head low to avoid the curious and judgmental stares of the neighbors. But the truth was impossible to hide now. The house of cards she had built on my quiet bankrolling and a foundation of ingratitude was dissolving right there on the sidewalk, one discounted item at a time. Around 11 o'clock, when the crowd of bargain hunters had started to thin out, I saw Gertrude pull off her sunglasses and stare toward my house with a look of pure, concentrated venom on her haggard face. A few moments later, my doorbell began to ring in a frantic, demanding rhythm that spoke of a woman who had finally reached her breaking point. When I opened the door, Gertrude didn't wait for an invitation. She shoved her way past me and into my living room, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. "Are you happy now?" she screamed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and absolute humiliation. "Do you really want us to starve to death?" She began to list her grievances, accusing me of stalking them from across the street, hiring lawyers to ruin them, and cutting off their lifeline. She actually had the nerve to ask what kind of mother treats her children this way, claiming she had to sell her beloved car just to keep the lights on and pay for legal fees. Looking at her in that moment, I felt a strange sense of pity, not for her situation, but for the fact that even now, she completely failed to see that her own greed had been the architect of her ruin. I sat down slowly in my leather armchair and gestured to the seat across from me, but Gertrude remained standing, her chest heaving as she paced the floor like a cornered animal. I told her that we should set aside the theatrics and speak the only language she truly cared about, which was the language of numbers. In the steady, clinical tone I had used during my decades managing millions for investment firms. I explained that the $180,000 debt was the cold cash I had paid to Wells Fargo to save her home from foreclosure. According to the laws of North Carolina, that was a documented loan with a signature, not a gift without strings. I pointed out that her habit of spending well over the credit limit was a sign of reckless financial mismanagement, not a burden I had placed on her. I told her clearly that I wasn't hounding anyone. I was simply demanding the basic level of financial responsibility required of any adult. I pulled the prepared asset declaration from my desk and noted that the money she made at her yard sale this morning might cover the interest for the month. But if she wanted the lawsuit dropped, she would have to show me a level of humility she had never before possessed. Gertrude's demeanor shifted instantly. Her face contorted into a dark, bitter sneer, and she reached for the last weapon in her arsenal: emotional blackmail. She looked me in the eye and laughed, a sound that was devoid of any real joy. "Fine," she said. "You have the money and the legal upper hand. But you should remember that Dway is your only son. If you keep pushing us like this, I will make sure you never lay eyes on your grandchildren again. I will take them so far away that you will never find them. You choose, Mrs. Hill. Is it your money or is it your family?" My heart seized for a split second, because she had finally hit the one pressure point every grandmother fears. But then I looked into her calculating eyes and realized this was just another disgusting form of manipulation, a desperate attempt to use children as currency. I stood up, walked slowly to the front door, and swung it wide open to let the fresh air flood the room. I told her that she was profoundly mistaken, because love and family bonds can never be purchased with blackmail. I warned her that by using those children as pawns, she wasn't just betraying me, she was actively destroying her own children's future and peace of mind. I told her I was fairly certain a family court would have a very dim view of a mother using her kids as a shield to evade a legal debt. I looked at her with a calm, unwavering gaze and told her to get out of my house. I warned her never to bring up my grandchildren as a bargaining chip again for as long as she lived. Gertrude's face went pale, and she looked as though she wanted to scream. But the cold professional steel in my eyes seemed to stop the words in her throat. She stomped out onto the porch, turning back one last time to throw a look of pure hatred in my direction, before disappearing back across the street. As I stood alone in the silence of my home, I felt a profound sense of relief. I knew I had just passed the hardest test a grandmother could face. But standing firm against her emotional terrorism was the only way to truly protect the integrity of my family. I had reclaimed my self-respect, and in doing so, I had finally shown Gertrude that some things are simply not for sale. Losing your grandchildren is a heartbreak like no other. Mrs. Hill chose truth over Gertrude's manipulation, but at a heavy cost. Was she too harsh? Or was this necessary to teach accountability? Could you sacrifice that bond to stand for what's right? Please share your wisdom below on the line between love and enabling. The house across the street was swallowed by a terrifying silence tonight. There were no lights flickering in the living room, and the blue glow of the television that Clarence usually kept on until the early hours was nowhere to be seen. It was a darkness that mirrored the emptiness of their pockets, and more importantly, the hollow state of their souls. I sat by my window, the cool air of the evening pressing against the glass, and I found myself turning my old wedding ring around my finger. I wondered for a moment if the price I was forcing my son to pay was too steep, if the weight of this lesson was more than he could bear. But then, I saw the front door of that house open, a figure stepped out onto the porch, and this time there was no hesitation. He didn't look like a man trying to hide in the shadows as he had before. Dwayne walked down the steps with a slow, heavy gait, but his movements were deliberate and sure. He didn't go for the car. He walked straight toward my house, under the amber glow of the Charlotte street lamps, looking like a man who had finally finished a long and exhausting struggle with his own conscience. When Dwayne entered my living room, he didn't sit down. He stood in the center of the floor, looking me directly in the eye, and began to tell me what had just happened. A massive, ground-shaking argument had erupted when Gertrude tried once more to force him into a scheme to manipulate me using the grandchildren. For the first time in 10 years of marriage, Dwayne had found his voice. He told me he had shouted so loudly that even Clarence and Dorothy had retreated into the guest room in shock. He told Gertrude that it was over, that I was not a bank, and I was certainly not their enemy. He finally admitted out loud that I was the only person who had ever truly saved them when they had nothing, and that they had repaid that grace by throwing my life into the street. He looked his wife in the eye and told her he would be filing for divorce if the lies and the manipulation didn't stop immediately. He had realized that Gertrude didn't love the man he was. She loved the lifestyle he had been able to provide through my quiet support. The collapse of that marriage was a deep pain. But for Dwayne, it was clearly a necessary release. He looked like he was finally breathing real air for the first time in a decade. "Mom, I am not here to ask you to drop the lawsuit," Dwayne said, his voice trembling, but lacking the cowardice that had defined him for so long. "I am here to give you this." He placed a thick folder on my mahogany desk. Inside were documents showing his request for overtime at work and a painstakingly detailed plan he had written to cut his expenses to the absolute bare minimum. He had even listed his prized watch collection for sale on a luxury exchange site. He told me he was going to pay back every cent of that $180,000. He said it might take 10 years, or it might take the rest of his life, but he was committed to seeing it through. He told me he wasn't doing it because the law required it, but because it was the only way he could ever look at himself in the mirror again, without seeing a hollow man. As I looked at him, I saw the ghost of my late husband in the set of his jaw and the honesty in his eyes. He was finally becoming a man who understood that honor is built on accountability, not on easy handouts. I picked up the folder and slowly turned the pages, seeing his messy, frantic handwriting and the clumsy but sincere calculations he had made. My eyes began to blur as I realized the effort he was putting into this transformation. "Dwee, I don't need your money to live a good life. I have more than enough. What I needed was for you to understand that family is not something you can mortgage for your own convenience." I decided right then to offer him a different kind of deal, one that was based on mentorship rather than charity. I told him I would stay the legal proceedings on one condition. He had to finish what he started and resolve the toxic situation in his home on his own. I told him he had to bring my grandchildren to see me every single weekend, but he would have to live in that house across the street and face the quiet and the bills and the reality of the life he had built. I told him I would not give him another penny, but I would be right here, directly across the street, watching him become the man he was always meant to be. Dwee sank to his knees beside my chair and buried his face in my lap, weeping like the little boy I used to hold. These were the kind of tears that cleanse the soul, washing away the vanity and the greed, and opening a new chapter for both of us. When Dwee finally left, and walked back across the street. I stood on my porch and watched him. The house over there was still dark, but I saw the small, steady beam of his flashlight click on as he stepped through the front door. He was literally finding his way through the dark he had created. The judgment of his own conscience had finally achieved what my lectures never could. Tomorrow, I will call my attorney and adjust the terms of our agreement. I am not looking for revenge, and I am not looking to win. I am simply teaching my son how to love, and that true love always comes with the weight of responsibility. I walked back into my quiet, warm home, feeling a peace I haven't known in years. Charlotte felt beautiful tonight, and even though I know the path ahead of us is still steep and full of challenges, I know we are finally walking in the right direction. The truth has been told, the pain has been named, and the real healing has finally begun. 3 weeks have slipped by since that rainy night when Dwee broke down in my living room, a lifetime of suppressed tears finally washing away the facade he had tried so hard to maintain. During those 21 days, I never once crossed the street to my old home, though I stood by my panoramic window every single morning. I watched the rhythm of their new, difficult life from my sanctuary of light. I saw my son leave for work in the gray hours before dawn and return long after the street lamps had flickered on. The flashy, polished SUV that Gertrude used as a trophy of her perceived status disappeared, replaced by a much older, more practical sedan. But the most significant sight was on a somber Tuesday afternoon when I watched Clarence and Dorothy Webster's car, packed to the roof with suitcases and boxes, pull out of the driveway for the last time. They left as quietly as they had arrived, moving on like parasites to find a new host for their entitlement. This morning, the Charlotte sky is a brilliant, piercing blue, and the air carries the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. It is the day we have all agreed to meet to finalize the terms of our new reality. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Dwee walked in first, and I was struck by the change in him. He had lost weight, and there were new lines around his eyes, but the hollow, haunted look had gone. In its place was the quiet sharpness of a man who was finally taking ownership of his own life. Gertrude followed closely behind him. She wasn't wearing her signature silks or her expensive jewelry today. She stood in the center of my living room, her hands tightly interlaced in front of her, her eyes fixed on the pale oak floor, as if she were searching for a way to vanish. I sat in my armchair, the massive window behind me framing the house I had spent my life savings to protect. I told them I assumed my attorney had sent over the final drafts of the agreement. I kept my voice steady and professional, the tone of a woman who had already won the most important battle. I informed them that the lawsuit would be formally withdrawn the moment the final condition was met. Then, I looked directly at Gertrude and told her I was listening. The room fell into a heavy, thick silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, which seemed to be counting down the final seconds of a long and bitter era of ingratitude. Gertrude took a long, shaky breath and finally looked up at me. Her eyes were rimmed with red, and though her expression was still somewhat strained, the arrogance had been completely stripped away. She spoke in a voice so low, I had to lean in slightly to catch the words. She said she was sorry. She apologized for treating me poorly and for the unforgivable act of throwing me out of my own home. I watched her closely, feeling no surge of triumph, only a quiet, lingering sadness. I knew this apology didn't come from a deep well of heartfelt remorse. It was born of the harsh necessity of her circumstances and the suffocating pressure of the debt she could not pay. But for me, that was enough. I didn't need a fake, manufactured love from her. I simply needed the public admission that she had been wrong. I told her I accepted her apology, not because I had forgotten what she did, but because I wanted my son and my grandchildren to have a future that wasn't poisoned by resentment. I pushed the withdrawal papers toward her, my signature already there, sharp and final. Dwayne picked up the document, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at the ink. He tried to thank me, his voice thick with emotion, but I raised my hand to stop him. I told him not to be so quick with his gratitude. I reminded him that this was a loan, not a gift. The new agreement stated clearly that he would pay me back a fixed amount every single month based on his actual income. I made it very clear that I would not be providing another cent for their utility bills, their groceries, or their luxury vacations. They would have to learn the weight and the worth of every dollar they earned. I then turned my gaze back to Gertrude, who looked as though she had just been given a chance to breathe again. I told her she could stay in that house, but she would never again have the power to decide who belonged there. I reminded her that it was the home of my son and my grandchildren, and if she ever repeated her disrespectful behavior, I would not hesitate to exercise my rights as a creditor. The steel in my voice was a new boundary, an unshakable order that would never be crossed again. After they left, I stood alone on my porch, watching them walk back across the asphalt. Dwayne went straight to the backyard and brought the grandchildren out to play. I watched the little ones running across the green grass, the same grass that Dwayne would now have to maintain with his own 2 hands. He looked over at me and gave a sincere, lingering wave. A warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the sun. I had lost my ground floor room in the old house, but I had reclaimed my position as a mother and a grandmother who was truly respected. I walked back into my office and opened my laptop to browse through travel itineraries for seniors. I thought about New England in the fall, or perhaps that garden architecture class Martha had mentioned. My life would no longer revolve around serving the needs of the ungrateful. I was going to live for myself, in a home I had purchased with my own wisdom, surrounded by neighbors who genuinely cared. Looking at the morning light dancing across my hydrangeas, I found myself smiling. I had given my son the most precious legacy I could offer, the understanding that love must be tempered with discipline, and that forgiveness only has value when the one who wandered is willing to do the work to find their way back. Dwayne was growing through the hardship, and that was a far greater gift than the $180,000 I had used to save him. Tonight, I will invite Martha over for tea, and we will sit in the garden and plan out the new flower beds. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It is about building a stronger, more honest future on the lessons learned through the pain. I took a deep, clear breath, feeling an absolute sense of freedom. The dawn had truly arrived, not just over the streets of Charlotte, but deep within my own heart. 6 months have passed since the day I signed that life-changing agreement. This afternoon, I am sitting on the porch of my new home, sharing a pitcher of cold, sweet North Carolina peach tea with Martha. The sun is golden and warm, casting long shadows across the yard where the sound of my grandchildren's laughter rises like music. They are helping Dwayne tend to the new hydrangea beds, their small hands covered in dirt as they learn the value of nurturing something beautiful. Gertrude is no longer a part of our daily life. She chose a different path after finding that the reality of independence without my support was a burden she was not willing to carry. While that realization brought its own kind of quiet sorrow, I am no longer weighed down by it. Every month, I receive a payment from Dwayne. It is not a large amount, but it carries the weight of his hard work and his growing sense of self-worth. I have finally booked that Rhodes Scholar trip to New England for the fall to see the maple leaves turn, a dream I had tucked away for far too long. I have finally understood that the greatest legacy I can leave for my son is not a house or a bank account. It is the image of a mother who knows how to love herself enough to protect her own dignity. My dear friends, as Mrs. Hill's journey comes to a close, the echoes of her strength remain with us. When we saw her walking into the cold night with nothing but a suitcase, or when she used her professional wisdom to reclaim her life, we felt a power that was much greater than mere survival. It was not the power of revenge, but the power of a profound awakening. Mrs. Hill has taught us that love does not mean giving others permission to trample on our values. For women in the sunset of their lives, financial and emotional independence is the strongest armor they can wear to protect their own happiness and the character of their children. Sometimes, the toughest love is the most effective medicine for a family that has lost its way to ingratitude. Where did Mrs. Hill's journey touch your heart the most? Do you feel her choice was too harsh? Or was it the lesson that so many families today are missing? I truly want to hear your stories and the lessons you have taken from this experience. Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. Every story you share helps us all become a little more compassionate and a little more aware of our own worth.